All right. So today we have Thomas Myrtle on from Ontario, Canada. Is that right, Thomas?
That's right. Toronto,
Oh,
Toronto,
oh.
Ontario.
Well, we're glad to have you. Now we have a bunch of different, guilters and people, truthers, innocenters, or whatever you want to call them. They all have their own theories. They have their information. They research. Pretty much everybody that's obsessed with this case has researched into this a certain amount. Spent a certain amount of time looking into certain things that they find interesting. But you, however, through Ronnie, have provided tons and tons of very interesting information. In a lot of cases, things that I haven't even heard other people talk about. So, regardless of what I think or anybody else thinks, I wanted to bring you on here as my first live guest and just talk about some things. Now, first, just to start off, have you read the affidavit of Greg McCrary?
Uh, I am not entirely familiar with that affidavit. No.
Are you aware of page 8 being missing from the or redacted from the affidavit?
No, I have noticed that in some of the documents in this case. I've noticed that uh, most recently. I've noticed that in the case of the evidence concerning the hood latch, one of the documents was missing there, or one of the in terms of one of the affidavits of Zellner, there was a missing page. I have not noticed that with the McCrary affidavit. That's interesting, though.
Okay. Well, what I thought was interesting about it, and I didn't know this, and like I say, I've watched Making a Murderer years ago, and then I've rewatched it in the years leading up to right now. And then it wasn't until recently I felt led to just see in front of this camera, even as an introvert like I am, I can sit here and I can talk about this all day, and nobody is sitting over there acting like they don't want to hear me talk. So that's why I started doing this. And before we went live, I was actually encouraging Thomas that he really should start his channel because I think he is very intelligent, regardless if you agree with any of his information or theories or not. And he has a great voice for YouTube or radio, particularly. But on page 8, I'm assuming that there was something on there that was redacted that we wasn't supposed to know because on page 9 at the very first sentence it picks up and it starts talking about that the fact that Teresa was involved with some adult entertainment photography. Do you know anything about that? Can you speak to anything that you know about her being involved with that?
I can. In fact, she did advertise. In fact, on her online presence, she advertised for adult entertainment services. And in terms of the evidence that has been, produced by Zellner and other people from her email, she had been, in fact, working with a number of clients in the area of pornographic type photography. She was working with an individual named Bradley Check. In fact, Bradley Check was a executive producer for CBS News in Green Bay, and he and his wife Casey had Teresa take a number of nude photographs of them. This later became an issue when Bradley Check, in fact, entered into a physical relationship with Teresa, and this ultimately became an issue in Bradley and Casey's divorce, and Teresa was in fact a witness in their divorce case. She was actually visiting the courthouse in Calumet County in connection with their divorce case. Very shortly, not long before her death, I believe.
So, just so I understand correctly, are we talking about when they say Teresa was, having an affair with a married man? Is this the person that we're talking about?
Yes, that would be Bradley Check, and he is also believed to be the one who was connected to those harassing phone calls that Tom Pierce talked about in his testimony and in some various interviews. He is believed to be the source of those harassing phone calls. There's different ideas about that, but that is generally believed to be the source of those calls.
Well, that's definitely something I want to learn more about, and I will in the future. And probably pretty sure I'll be relying on you for more, information, articles, or whatever on that. But I want to start out. I really want to get your take on this whole thing in general. Now, you told me that some people might think that your views on this whole situation is controversial, but nonetheless, I want to I basically want you to give me a rundown of some of the things that you think, that took place. And I remember you mentioning something about Gregory Allen, and you could start there if you want to, but I think we'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, all right. I mean, my position is that Gregory Allen was systematically protected from 1980 to 1995. I mean, you see a pattern when you look at his police files, which are available on StephenAveryCase.org. You see a pattern of charges being reduced or dismissed, often by Dennis Vogel. Dennis Vogel appears often in these documents as intervening seemingly on Gregory Allen's behalf. An example of that would be, of course, the infamous August 1983 beach assault, in which Gregory Allen exposed himself to a woman and lunged at her. And this was on the same beach that Penny Bernstein was assaulted 2 years later. Dennis Vogel prosecuted the case, and in fact, what most people don't know is that he reduced the charge from indecent exposure to disorderly conduct, and that is absolutely a pattern in Gregory Allen's criminal record, is an uncharacteristic leniency in law enforcement's handling of him. And I think, there's been various theories about that, whether in fact he might have been a confidential informant of some type, or maybe there's something even worse than that, like maybe he was, maybe he knew somebody, maybe he had something on somebody, like there's it definitely seems to be very strange how, where Gregory Allen was concerned, there was a much different standard applied to him than there was applied to Stephen Avery. That much we can, I think, say for sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, the fact that you wouldn't even look into the fact that Gregory Allen was, he was under surveillance by the Manitowoc City Police, and that you had people, I want to say, in the DA's office telling Dennis Vogel that, I think you have the wrong guy. You might want to look at Gregory Allen. I mean, to our knowledge, that right there, they just turned a blind eye to it and apparently didn't look into it anymore. For instance, when Stephen Avery was let out of prison and the new district attorney called Dennis Vogel, he even said in the show that he thought it was interesting that the very first thing that Dennis Vogel said was, "Do I have anything about Gregory Allen in Stephen Avery's file?"
Right.
So, I just thought that was interesting. Now,
and that was in reference to that August 1983 assault that Gregory Allen had committed. I don't know if it would be correct necessarily to characterize it as an assault. That may imply some physicality. What we do know is that he exposed himself to this woman and then lunged at her. I don't know that he touched her, but what I do know is that the charge was initially indecent exposure. Dennis Vogel was prosecuting the case and reduced the charge to disorderly conduct. And again, that is a pattern in Gregory Allen's treatment by law enforcement, charges either being dismissed or reduced by the authorities. And I want to touch on something that you said as well about Gregory Allen. He actually had a number of cases that were either prosecuted by Vogel or presided over by Fred Hazelwood, who of course was the judge in Avery's 1985 case. So the people in Manawak County knew who this guy was.
Right.
They knew very well and I also wanted to touch on the fact that you were mentioning that the Manawak police were monitoring him. I found it very interesting, and they mentioned this in Making a Murderer episode 1. One of Avery's civil attorneys mentions that, and I quote, as fate would have it, the surveillance of Gregory Allen was terminated just hours before he assaulted Penny Bernstein, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, I did too as well. And one thing that was interesting was the fact that when Andy Colburn got the call from Brown County, I believe it was, and they asked, they told, presumably Colburn relayed this message to his superiors, but didn't fill out a report about the call. Do you know anything or have any more information about that call? I've always been curious to that part of it when Colburn gets the call. I mean, I would think that a police officer, regardless of reporting it to supervisors, would still be required to fill out a report.
I would tend to agree. I would tend to think so, but the fact is that the common counter argument that we hear is that, oh, well, Andy Colburn was just a jailer. All he did was he took a call and, he just transferred it to the appropriate authorities. Well, you know what? Once he realized that his superiors weren't going to report that, once Kosurik told him to forget about that, and once he should have relayed that to Avery's attorneys, who were then appealing their client's conviction, on the basis of DNA evidence under the victim's fingernails that did not match Avery. And of course, Hazelwood ruled that the DNA evidence, just because it didn't match Avery, it could have been Tom Bernstein, or it could have been some of the other people who helped her on the beach and who clothed her, which of course, why would she, as one of Avery's civil attorneys mentioned, why would she have clawed any of those people? Why would their DNA end up under her fingernails? But with this controversy over the identity of the assailant and Avery's appeal going through the courts, once Colburn realized that his superiors were not going to follow up that information, he should have absolutely relayed that information to Avery's attorneys. And the fact that he didn't, at the very least, shows that he is willing to take unethical orders, to comply with unethical orders, which in this case would be Kosurik's order to forget about it, which was documented in that memo from Douglas Jones, which came out during Avery's lawsuit. Where that's another issue, is that some guilters like to suggest that the Brown County call, that nobody knows who this was, or who the memo from Douglas Jones with the Rohrer Jones memo makes very clear that they knew exactly what this call was about, that it concerned Allen, Avery, and Penny Bernstein.
Well, let me ask you a question. Let's hit on 2 points. Let's say that hypothetically that someone was protecting Gregory Allen. Do you have any information on who or why or what, why, or do you have any ideas or thoughts of why they would be protecting Gregory Allen? Did he know somebody, or did he know something? Did he have something on somebody? Because it seemed like he committed quite a bit of crimes that even beforehand, that if Avery would have committed, they would have put him away for a long time.
I would tend to agree as well, and in terms of naming names as to who was protecting Gregory Allen, Dennis Vogel would be on top of that list. Dennis Vogel shows up repeatedly in Gregory Allen's prosecutions and such, as somebody who was reducing charges for him, somebody who was dismissing charges for him. There was one case in which he assaulted somebody. I believe it was, I to the best of my recollection, I believe this was him assaulting a police officer. hitting a police officer, which is, the type of offense you would generally expect, the guy would get the book thrown at him, but, Dennis Vogel implored the officer to ensure that their identification was correct, which it's a shame that was not done with Avery when, instead with Avery, Dennis Vogel actually advised Penny Bernstein to lie in court. Penny Bernstein actually confided to Vogel that she was only 85% sure that Avery was the assailant, and Vogel counseled her, you in court, you should say that you're 100% sure. Vogel essentially suborned perjury,
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Well,
Guilters, you brought up Guilters a while ago. Guilters, they, you and Ronnie are kind of like my allies in the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and the one group that we're all in together, because Guilters, they, you can't. I've tried to get them on for debate and discussion, and they just don't want to do it.
It's a little bit of a garbage fire, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it blows my mind how if you throw them any bit of shade, if you disagree with them at all or anything, then they jump on you like a pack of wolves or whatever.
Oh yeah.
And that's the thing. I've always, I don't sit here and speak about a fact unless I know it's a fact. And I'm not as in depth as some people on this case. But when it boils down to it, people like you and me, people like them that's in a group, all you can really do is speculate on a bunch of things. Now, you can have proof, you can have articles, you can have documents, you can have pictures on some things, but they get on to us for speculating, but that's all they do. The only thing they can do is throw up a court document. And my whole argument is, well, if he's guilty, of course you can find plenty of information to support his guilt by all of the court documents. But if he was framed, you're not going to have any of that. You're not going to have, I mean, for instance, the key. All right. They search the trailer and they search it and they search it. Colburn and Link winds up going over there. All of a sudden, the key's found. Same thing with the bullet. Link, the bullet wasn't found in the garage until Link went, and helped search, and then all of a sudden, the bullet's found. Well, we don't have a piece of paper from the court saying that Lieutenant Link and Andrew Colburn planted the key in the bullet, but it's heavy speculation. It's highly suspicious that that's what happened. But as far as Teresa Halbach is concerned, because I want to hit on a bunch of different points with you. What is your opinion on what actually happened to Teresa? Some people think she was killed. Some people think she wasn't killed. Some people think, that the bones that were found were a girl named Carmen. If you can elaborate, a little bit on what do you think exactly happened? What's your theory about Teresa Halbach?
In my view, the stage was set for what occurred, and that's about all I can say. What I would commit to as a theory, the stage was set, and that, of course, is where my theory becomes controversial to many people, is that I believe that there was a conspiracy on the part of multiple individuals, that I believe this was something that was systemic in nature, that this was something that involved multiple people within multiple agencies, and that this was about protecting the system as a whole. And I believe that if she did, in fact, if she was in fact killed the way that we were told that she was killed, then they were probably waiting for her, as she left that property. And whether whichever pair of hands committed the murder,
Right.
I believe they did not do it. Like let's say that Bobby and Scott did it, or let's say that Ryan did it, or let's say that whichever name you want to name, whichever insert the name here, whichever there's any number of alternative suspects who were never investigated, by the way. If the guilters wanted to make fun of people bringing up these various people, the fact of the matter is we're not saying that they did it, we're saying that the police never looked into it.
Right. They was never looked at as a valid suspect.
Yeah, and in some cases with Ryan, for example, he was basically made a part of the investigation, which is absurd. But I mean, whichever pair of hands it was, I don't believe it was an accident that this happened. days before Thomas Kasurik and Dennis Vogel were to be, sworn in and, ask questions and, give their depositions. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that the timing is a coincidence at all. To me, the timing is the key to this case. It proves the systemic nature of this, the fact that the system was, closing ranks essentially and uniformly kind of acting in defense of itself. And that's what the October 31st, 2005 was,
Right. Do you think that, for instance, if let's say that the stage was set, do you think that a large amount of people would have had to be on this? I mean, what is how many people do you think it would take, or how many people do you think would have knowledge of this? How many people do you think would be involved to be able to? I guess what I'm asking is, in theoretically, let's say she was killed. Do you do you
Okay.
think do you think Ryan Hillegas, because in Greg McCrary's, I can hardly say his name, in his affidavit, he's a forensic psychologist. He is a FBI profiler. In that affidavit, he's basically laying out why he thinks Hillegas is the prime suspect, and he actually mentioned something that I thought was interesting, because I said it in one of my other videos. Typically, a murder of this kind, you know, the killer likes to, first of all, revisit the crime scene. I mean, I don't know if anybody's, how many crime shows y'all watched. I watched tons, but typically killers that commit these gruesome type of murders, they like to revisit the crime scene and they like to interject themselves into the investigation. And he was literally in between law enforcement. He was the connection between law enforcement and Teresa Halbach's family. If she was killed, just as a theory, do you think Ryan Hillegas fits that mold well or not?
I mean, without a strong evidentiary kind of basis, it's difficult for me to, say what exactly the extent of his involvement was. But it seems very clear that he was drafted into the investigation, or he became involved in the investigation, whether that was due to his inserting himself into the investigation, or police kind of inserting him into the investigation, pressing him into service, so to speak. Either way, it's absolutely bizarre and insane to me that the ex-boyfriend would have that type of access, both to the family and to the suspected crime scene. Being allowed to enter restricted areas day after day after day. I mean, that doesn't make any sense from my perspective. As to exactly what the extent of his involvement was, I don't know, but I think it's very possible that he was involved in some extent in in manipulating evidence and perhaps planting evidence. I believe that he was kind of what I would characterize, in deep politics, we talk about, the sponsor facilitator, the sponsor facilitator model, where you have the individuals who are the sponsors are the ones who are really coordinating this operation, who are the ones who are really, directing the course of this thing, and the facilitators are everybody in between. And there's mid-level facilitators. There's, people who are on the upper end of the facilitators, and those are people who are carrying out various parts of the operation. And a necessary part to understand how these things can work without, anybody squawking, so to speak, is compartmentalization, which is built into every kind of covert operation, where everybody only knows their part. Nobody is told, you're not brought into it. Let's say you're Ryan, you're not brought into a smoky room and told, we killed Teresa. Now here's what you got to do. You're just told your part. You're just told do this, and you're probably given a good reason for it too. You're probably given a reason like, we know this guy did it, and you're going to help us prove that he did it so he doesn't get away with it again. You're probably given some line.
And if there was somebody you cared about,
exactly.
And depending on what type of person you are, and the police come to you and like, look, we know this guy killed him, and here's some evidence to prove that he killed her, but we're gonna need your help to make sure that this scumbag goes down for it, or whatever. I would
Exactly.
imagine he would be all up for it. But
I think that's what happened with Mike.
right.
That's what happened with Mike. I have something that Mike said that really kind of upset me, and of course, on that group that we're both in, they get really upset whenever you talk about the family. One thing that Mike said that really upset me was when he said, he thinks that he can get out of this again. I don't think so. So Mike is already suggesting that somehow it was some kind of O.J. Simpson type. He got off with the 1985 thing, which I thought shows how little Mike knows about the
that's a
1985 case and the background of this. But go ahead.
That's a reoccurring theme in this whole case that blows my mind. Even Eugene Cachet, in that deposition, I just want to reach over there and slap the piss out of him, because he's like, the pencil's over there, and he's like, well, and the attorney asked him, well, you believe that the DNA proves that Stephen Avery is innocent? He's like, well, you know that. I don't know that. DNA
knows that.
Yeah, DNA's been manipulated before or whatever, and this and this and that. And I'm just, that's a reoccurring theme throughout. I mean, even when they asked the I think it was Lieutenant Link. I'll correct myself if I think of it. But during the trial, they said, well, don't you think it would have been fairer to Stephen Avery if Fassbender would have known you was deposed in his lawsuit? And he said no. Yeah. I mean, that's a reoccurring theme that they still, even after proven innocent, I mean, it just clearly shows how much they hate Stephen Avery.
Sure.
But
yeah.
Going back to Ryan Hillegas for 1 second, when I first learned about the marks on his hands and supposedly some scratches on his neck, I was like, oh, whatever. That's probably just some fake theory or something. But then I was watching the show for myself again, rewatching it, and I got that part where he's sitting down on the ground talking to the search party. And whenever his hand comes up in the screen, I paused it. And he does have marks. It looks like bruises or grease or something on the back of his hands.
He does indeed.
I found that interesting once I seen it for myself. And prior to seeing that for myself, I didn't put much stock into him being someone that could pull this off by himself. But what I thought was interesting when you mentioned about, and I don't care if I piss guilters off or not, because I'm not talking bad about Teresa Halbach. If she is dead, then I have all the sympathy in the world for her, and I hope that her real killer is found. But what I thought was interesting about Mike Halbach, and a lot of people think the same thing, is I was showing my wife, she don't really care too much. She, watches it with me every now and then. But I said, look at what this guy says. And they, asking him about the grieving process, and he said it might take a couple of days. Now,
that was very strange.
Yeah, and they don't even know that she's dead at this point.
And he volunteered the words grieving process, by the way. They didn't ask him about grieving. Yeah, he said they asked, I believe, if my recollection is correct, and if it's not, I absolutely apologize to Mike and to whoever else, but I believe that the question was something like, how are you holding up? And he said that, he immediately said, well, the grieving process could last days, it could last weeks, it could last months, which, I found the first time I watched it to be, quite a strange statement to make. Of course, Mike Halbach, we have to also remember, it was a graduate of the communications program at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and he had actually taken a crisis management course a couple of months before his sister's disappearance, where he had, he was part of a kind of a drill where they dealt with how to handle the media in terms of handling a public relations crisis. So, of course, he was immediately kind of fell into that role of being the family spokesperson. And so we do have to, kind of understand that maybe to a certain extent he was kind of speaking PR in some of these situations. And maybe that's the reason why his reactions and why his behavior seems so unnatural to so many people, is because he was kind of adopting that role of being a spokesperson, and maybe the Mike
Yeah, he
Halbach.
was. 'Cause he's the only one of the family that, actually got in front of that camera quite a bit to do interviews and stuff like that. But another interesting thing that we all know about is when when they're going out to search for Teresa, the reporter is talking to Ryan Hillegas. That whole exchange between the reporter, Ryan, and then when Mike steps up and kind of looks
Oh,
at him, and they have that awkward moment. To me, I mean,
that was really weird.
it is really strange. It's like when they asked Ryan, have you been out on the property or whatever they asked him, and then he has to think about it for a minute. Then Mike steps up and kind of look at him and was like, and then they start finishing each other's sentences. I thought that
Yeah.
was strange. And then Mike is also like, when right after that, they asked Mike, well, what do you hope to find? Now, I told my wife this. I said, if my daughter's missing or my son or my wife or I don't have a sister, but let's say my sister, and they ask me what I hope to find, I'm going to say, well, hopefully I know she's been missing for a few days, but hopefully in some kind of way she's alive and this was just some big misunderstanding or whatever. Well, he doesn't say any of that. He says, now this is not verbatim, but he says something to the effect of, well, I don't know if we hope to find her car and her be in there or this or that. Like, he doesn't say what you think that he should say, which is hopefully we find her and she's okay.
He's also kind of like, and I don't want to. I mean, he's kind of like, he has a really weird kind of expression when he says it. He's kind of like, kind of has this half smile on his face, and he's saying, I don't know whether you want to find her alive. I don't know whether you want to find the car. I don't know what to hope, which is, seems very much like, if I were in his position, it's quite natural what you would hope, that you would find that there would be some kind of innocent, innocuous explanation for all of this and that she would be alive and all that, But what I had found especially upsetting, and this was not in the docuseries, that's one thing I want to really drive home, is that the docuseries, when people talk about how they left things out that were, favorable to the prosecution, there is just as much, if not more, that was left out that is arguably more favorable to the defense. An example of that would, of course, be Sherry Culhane, the fact that she testified against Avery in 1985, and the fact that she reappeared in 2007 and to testify against him again. I in my opinion, they absolutely should have included that fact, that little tidbit as well, the fact that she was a witness against Avery in his wrongful conviction. But, getting back to it, I think that one of the things that they should have covered in terms of in terms of the family and such, was the fact that Mike Halbach was actually shared a board later on with Jay Breyer, who helped them print up the missing posters. And now that's another whole area, is that the missing posters carried the date November 2, 2005. If you look at the footer, the missing posters actually carried the date November 2, 2005, which is, of course, a day before she was officially reported missing. And that's never really been adequately explained. I know that some people have suggested that perhaps that was a default kind of option that was in there, but if you look into Jay Breyer, the person who ran the organization YES, which was Youth Educated in Safety, I believe. He was the one who helped organize the search with them and helped organize the missing posters. Jay Breyer had a kind of a very checkered history. He was accused by his own board at YES for misappropriating funds, and he was accused of all different types of financial corruption and stuff. The Wisconsin DOJ investigated YES and investigated Jay Breyer, and the investigating the agent who was assigned to that investigation was none other than Deb Strauss, who was one of the two agents who conducted the Attorney General's office's internal review of Manawak County in the 85 case. And she was one of the agents who found that there was no wrongdoing by Manawak County in 1985. And Deb Strauss said that during Avery's lawsuit, emails were produced that showed that Deb Strauss acknowledged that there was no real investigation by Manawa County, and that kind of was in direct contradiction to her and the Attorney General's office conclusion that there was no misconduct in the investigation. And so it's very interesting that when Jay Breyer, who helped the Halbach family organize the missing persons search and helped them print the missing persons posters, when he was investigated by his own board, it was Deb Strauss who was assigned by the Wisconsin DOJ to investigate Jay Breyer, and she concluded that there was no wrongdoing on the part of Jay Breyer, and she instead Strauss and the Wisconsin DOJ turned their attention to the board and investigated the board's handling of the complaints against Jay Breyer, and kind of took Jay Breyer's side. And a later board that was appointed, an entirely different group of people, concluded that Jay Breyer, was in fact misappropriating funds. So, the second board that was, I don't know, this might be getting a little bit inside, but it looks like Jay Breyer was misappropriating funds from this organization, but the Wisconsin DOJ and Deb Strauss covered for him effectively. And Jay Breyer later ends up on the board of another missing persons foundation. I believe it's called Mission Home, and I believe it was Mission Home Appleton or something like that. And Mike Halbach was one of the 3 board members alongside Jay Breyer. So that's very interesting that these players have kind of stayed together like that, But another thing I want to bring up about Deb Strauss as well, in light of all that, is I know I'm perhaps going all over the place here, but
no, go ahead, because I'm gonna bounce around all over the place too as soon as you're done. Keep going.
Perfect. I mean, Deb Strauss was, of course, you may know about that tape, that audio where Deb Strauss actually calls in on the night of November 4th, the night before the RAV is found, and she inserts herself into the investigation. She says that I know you guys, if you guys need any help or assistance, because I'm not a big fan of Steve Avery, and for some reason that she is allowed on the property the next day, and ends up, after the RAV is discovered, she ends up very much involved. I mean, that, I would think, in a saner, fairer investigation is exactly what should disqualify her from the case, but she took a very active role in the investigation after that. And I suspect, this is my theory, my speculation here, is that she was one of the people, along with Fassbender and some of these others, that we have not come to know yet, because of course the DCI files are still classified, effectively still sealed. Strauss and Fassbender and stuff, I suspect, were kind of providing oversight to this whole operation from the Attorney General's office. We're kind of running the whole thing.
I wouldn't doubt it at all. But I want to bounce real quick, and like I said, this is our first live stream. I'm sure the first of many. And hopefully from this you'll be encouraged to start your own channel. But I want to bounce to Pam Sturm. Now, she was a private investigator. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Now, one thing I thought was weird, and I've talked to people in this community of people that believe Stephen Avery is innocent, and it didn't interest them as much as it interests me. But and you can let me know if you think I'm reading too much into this, but in the show, when they're playing the audio of her calling saying that she found the car. Now, let me ask you a question. Most people, I can't ask everybody here, obviously, but most people know where the VIN number is located on their vehicle. Do you know where a VIN number is located on the vehicle?
I don't. I'm not very familiar with cars. I would expect that a private investigator would, though.
Exactly. Well, most people, but that's fine. Most people, I'd say 70-80% of people would know that the VIN number in the car is right down in front of the dash. You have to go to the driver's side windshield and look through the windshield, and there'll be a really long VIN number right there on a metal plate. Okay. So what I thought was interesting, and people, I don't think they found the same interest that I did. But in that audio, you can tell that she's standing at the back, towards the back of the vehicle. Let's say that. And she says, I found the car, and he asked for he said, where are you at? And then she eventually said, Avery's Auto Salvage or whatever. And then he asked for the VIN number. And she's like, can I go inside? And he's like, no, don't touch anything. Well, she's like, I've been trying to find the VIN number. Let me get around to it. And that's not verbatim, but essentially what struck me very odd was she said, I'm trying to find the VIN number. Now, I know this, and a lot of people I know this. I know exactly they're on the outside of the vehicle. Now, on the inside, I think it's in the door jamb and maybe a couple other places. But as far as the outside of the vehicle, without going in the vehicle, there's only one place you're going to find that VIN number. And like you just stated, they can't tell me that she didn't know where that VIN number was.
Yeah, she's a PI.
I found it I found it very interesting that she's like, yeah, let me try to find the VIN number. And you can hear her looking around. She's like, hold on, let me get to the front of the car. Like,
sounded like bad acting to me. The whole
listen, you just hit the nail on the head. It sounded scripted. Like it sounded like she was trying to make a script sound realistic. And it just baffled me how that whole, if you get a chance, and any of y'all listening, go to season 1, find the audio of Pam calling in, to find out, to let the police know that they found the RAV, and listen to that audio and see if you can understand what I'm saying, because I just thought that was very interesting that, how that whole conversation went down.
Yeah, and there's another thing that I find very interesting as well, is that Pam Sturm was actually a direct relative, I believe, of Sheriff Jerry Pagel.
Is that right?
Yeah. In fact, the Sturms, who of course are kind of a branch of the kind of connected to, rather, the Halbach family. Pam Sturm herself was a second cousin of Teresa Halbach. Pam Sturm, her family was had long-standing connections with New Holstein's police and fire departments. In fact, there were, if you look at the history of the New Holstein police and fire services, you'll find several Sturms who were police and fire chiefs, of New Holstein. So,
here's what Millbilly said. This is where you find the VIN numbers. Let's see if I can get it up there. You find the VIN number on the dash, the motor, transmission, frame, body, exterior fender, door jamb. I seen somebody else comment on the fender. Where on the fender? I guess they're talking about on the inside fender well, because I've never noticed that. I have to check into that. I didn't know that they put VIN numbers on the fender well. That could explain it. I'll have to look into that, but that's interesting. I didn't know they put VIN numbers on the fender well, so I learned something new today.
Yeah, I'm actually, I only have vision in one eye, so I've never even attempted to get a license. So I don't know much about cars. I don't know my RAV, as Henberry's famous post suggested. I've been meaning to get around to reading that.
Well, another thing I wanted to bring up is, why Stephen Avery? You have a bunch of Averys. It's believed that they were and I'm using some similar language to what was mentioned in the show. It's not my own view, but they were talked about in a way that kind of makes me think of like the eyesore of the community. They wasn't involved in the community. They didn't fit in the community, but there was a lot of Averys particularly on that salvage yard. Why Stephen? And I can tell you what I think. I think all of this stemmed from Sandra Morse, the incident with her, and being married to Will Morris that worked for the Manitowoc Sheriff's Department. Do you agree with that, or why do you think Stephen was the only Avery that they went after, or was he?
I mean, in a sense, I think that they did target the family in terms of making them scapegoats in terms of the community and such, but in terms of why Stephen, why would he be framed? I mean, he's the ideal patsy in some ways. If you look at his history and stuff, a lot of the guilters will obviously bring up all of these you know all of these very ugly incidents, that appear to be in his history and stuff, and my response to that is that patsies, saints don't make good patsies. You take somebody who has a limited limited intelligence, limited kind of a checkered history, and it's easy to make them into a scapegoat, and that's a story as old as time, like whichever whichever community you go to, you have those kinds of people who are kind of have these things hung on their heads. But I find it very interesting, expounding on that Kenny Peterson was actually the reporting officer in the cat incident. I thought that was very interesting, is that not only is Kenny Peterson one of the arresting officers in 1985, but he is the reporting officer in the cat incident, so which is even before Sandra Morris. So Kenny Peterson is rather ubiquitous. He shows up at the cat incident. He's the reporting officer there. He shows up in 1985. He arrests Avery with what proves to be a wrongful arrest, wrongful conviction. And then he's the sheriff at the time of the Halbach investigation. It's Manawoc isn't that small.
Well, I will say this: out of all the police officers that was shown on the show, Peterson, out of all of them, he just he's like dripping with spite towards Stephen Avery.
Yeah.
Like out of all of them, he looks like he could be the one. If somebody wanted to say that a cop killed Teresa Halbach, I would put money on Peterson. I mean, he just looks like somebody that, which you can't judge a book by its cover, but he looks like, and by his demeanor, things that he said, he looks like he absolutely hates Stephen Avery. So it is interesting that he was the arresting officer in the cat incident. So you're right. It goes back even further than Sandra Morris. So that's an interesting point. And I think he had a couple of robberies even before the cat where they broke in a bar and stole some beer or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. There's a couple of incidents with a burglary with some bar and such where they broke some stuff, broke a window or something, and stole a couple of packs of beer or a pack of beer. Yeah, I don't want to get too crazy here, but if you look at the phenomena of what they call gang stalking and such, it's interesting to apply that. You could almost interpret the Avery as being a highly documented case of that type of phenomena, where you have a number of individuals in a community targeting a person because they, kind of have personal dislike for them, or they view this person as lesser than them. I would refer back to that infamous email from Michael O'Kelly, where he describes the Avery family as being a branch of a poison tree or something like that. That's this horrible family, and it would be good if they were just cut off from the gene pool, something along those lines and stuff. Kind of illustrates the the picture that many people on the outside of Avery Road in that area had of the Avery family and of Stephen Avery. It's a very interesting insight into that. I think that that probably fueled this, and probably fueled it for a lot of the mid to low level players. Felt like participating in a conspiracy like this, participating in this operation, wasn't really so unethical, because they were just taking out this, from their perspective, this piece of human garbage, which
exactly.
To me, thinking about somebody in those terms, really reflects very poorly on those people's character, reflects very poorly on that community's character.
Yeah, well, every community has people like Stephen Avery, and as we all know, that's maybe not. Maybe they're not as bad, or maybe they haven't done things that their family has been accused of, or whatever. But there's people like Stephen Avery all over the United States in certain communities, and there's cops like Manitowoc County all over in in rural and communities and stuff like that. But before we end this, I just want to ask you, and we're definitely going to do this again. I really appreciate you coming on, but
Oh, sure.
in your opinion, is there anything that maybe we haven't, and it don't matter what it pertains to, is there any piece of information that you obsess about the most, or that you, or any particular topic within this case that maybe, is there any information that you have about anything that we haven't heard before that you'd like to share with us before we get off of here?
Oh, there's tons of it, Andrew. I kind of like, I view myself as the kind of guy like, I know Millbilly's here with us in the chat, and I have total respect for him. I think he knows this case better than a lot of people, certainly better than me. He's doing groundbreaking work on a lot of the audio in this case and stuff. I view myself as somebody who kind of picks up the loose ends that everybody else kind of ignores because they're just too crazy. They're kind of the pieces that just don't fit, and I just obsess over those. One thing I would like to, I do think that if she in fact was killed the way that they say that she was killed, I believe it was the system that did it. I believe that it was the cops that did it. I believe it was the state that did it, and I believe the orders came from the top, so to speak. And that's my belief. And I would refer to, and I often do refer to it, that picture from Making a Murderer where they show the timeline of the depositions in relation to the disappearance. That is the case to me.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, and people can say what they want. Guilters can say whatever they want. I don't give a crap what they say. But if you look, that Making a Murderer only show one side or this or this or that. If you look at that timeline, I mean, it is. And Mr. Paul has even mentioned this before. I mean, what a coincidence. I mean,
yeah, it's just too perfect.
It's that all of a sudden, Sandra Morris and Colburn and Link and Cachet and all these people are getting deposed. And here comes Kasurik and Dennis Vogel. And before they can even get deposed, I mean, this happened. I mean,
Avery was arrested a day before Kasurik's deposition. Like
you can't ask for a better situation for the sheriff and the DA, can you?
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. But if you want to know about, in terms of pieces like that that I'm obsessed about, one thing that really bothers me is the fact that in 1997, Scott Toddick, who, of course, if you're going to talk about Avery's background, because everybody knows that he's got a checkered past, but Scott Toddick, I mean, he's certainly got a checkered past as well, I believe. I mean, in Farak's book, they talk about how he severely beat his aging mother, he over something like money or something. But besides the point, Scott Toddick was in 1997 was charged with disorderly conduct, with battery, with disorderly conduct, with criminal damage to property, in connection with his continued harassment of his former girlfriend, Constance Wellnets, and the attorney who represented him in that 1997 case was a certain Mark Rohrer, who, of course, was Manawa County's district attorney from 2003 until, I believe, 2013 when he became a circuit court judge. That's one other thing that we can talk about maybe next time, is how everybody in this case got a reward of some type. Got judged. Got appointed to judgeships, or got awards, or got to promotions. That's one thing I've noticed. But
I could imagine.
But and I think that's plays into it too, the payoffs and stuff. But I find it very interesting that Mark Rohrer was representing Scott Toddick in 1997, and then in 2005 was being deposed in Avery's lawsuit. And one of the things that came up in that in his deposition was the fact that he had hid information from the Attorney General's office, possibly had hid information concerning the 1995 call, that the Attorney General's office did not have any of the documentation concerning the 1995 call, and of course none of that was represented or mentioned or addressed in their report. Nothing about the 1995 call was addressed in any way in the Attorney General's office report. And Mark Rohrer said he maintained that that he had provided that to them, that he and Mike Griesbach had provided that to them. And Avery's civil attorneys responded that well, none of what the Attorney General's office has, none of it concerns 1995 or Andrew Colburn or anything of that nature. And Mark Rohrer had no explanation for that. So either he's lying, or the Attorney General's office and Lautenschläger are lying. But of course, it's interesting that Mark Rohrer would show up in that way and be under scrutiny in that way. And of course, Mark Rohrer is also the one who gave the case to Kratz. And so it's very interesting that he was representing Scott Toddick in 1997 in that case. And what I find also very interesting is that the presiding judge in that case was Patrick Willis. But even more interesting to me is the fact that the prosecuting attorney in that case of Scott Toddick in 1997, with Willis and Rohrer defending Scott Toddick, the prosecuting attorney was Michael Griesbach, author, of course, of Indefensible, and very public kind of anti-Avery commentator, I guess you could say. And Michael Griesbach actually didn't dismissed by prosecutor's motion the charges of disorderly conduct and damage to property. So it's interesting that Michael Griesbach might have been a phone call away from Scott Toddick, as Mark Rohrer would have been, and Michael Griesbach also would have been a phone call away, possibly from the infamous German, who came up in the Convoluted Brian blog, because he was also prosecuting that individual. Of course, that individual's name is not known, but in Michael Griesbach's book Indefensible, he talks about him at length, and he calls him by the pseudonym Wolfgang Braun. And he's been under criticism before that he had the wife of the German man said that Michael Griesbach, when the German man was released and came to her, she was not informed that he was released. And also Michael Griesbach was also involved in prosecutions of a certain Gary Cree, who was involved with Carmen Boutwell, who was ordered not to have any contact with Carmen Boutwell a couple of weeks before Teresa's disappearance. We don't know virtually anything about Gary Cree other than the fact that he has a rap sheet, about as long as Gregory Allen. He was a repeat offender. He was consistently given Huber privileges, which means he can leave the jail during the day and under the pretense of some type of work release. And Gary Cree has also been brought up as an alternative suspect in certain quarters. So I find it, just to wrap that point up, I know I'm going all over the place, but just to wrap that point up, it's you have Michael Griesbach, author of Indefensible, a phone call away from at least 3 individuals who have been suggested as alternative suspects, which I find very interesting. I wonder if, in fact, Toddick or some other individual was asked by Griesbach or Rohrer or whoever to do some type of extra legal community service, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, I'm catching you. Well, it's very interesting, and you have tons of information. So like I said, you definitely need to consider doing your own YouTube channel. And I'm pretty sure that you would have, a lot of supporters to back your channel up. But this isn't going to be the last time we talk. And
hopefully not.
No, it's not going to be, definitely. I want to get Ronnie on here. I think he's too scared or something.
Hey, I was real nervous.
I'm always nervous no matter what, but I want to get Ronnie on here and other people as well. But look, it was very enjoyable to hear your thoughts, and unless there's anything else you want to say, I think we're going to leave it right here.
All right, Andrew. All I can say is I hope the truth comes out on this, if that's even possible at this point. See, it's very cautious optimism on my part, because I think that the corruption goes so deep that, you have Angela Sekowitz right now handling this case, of course, and denying Avery's requests to test evidence such as the RAV. And of course, you have Angela Sekowitz, as you may have seen. I posted photos and such that show that Angela Sekowitz was on the board of the Wisconsin crime victims rights board with Ken Kratz, and she's in the photo standing right behind him, and she also went to Marquette University with him. She was in, I believe Kratz was a graduate of the '85 class, and she was a graduate of the '84 class. So they were.
He probably sexted her quite a bunch.
Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah, no.
All right. Well, everybody that's watching, appreciate y'all watching. Y'all can share this video, whatever y'all want to do. And we're going to leave it right there. And then me and Thomas will definitely have another live stream here soon. And Thomas, I really appreciate you coming on with me tonight.
Oh, no problem, Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.